Hello, this is Erik Vuurman, and I welcome you to this presentation of the Maastricht driving test. This is part 2, which is an update of a previous presentation I uploaded in May of this year, and it is about lapses of attention as a secondary variable of driving impairment. What is new in this presentation is that we have looked at an alternative way of detecting lapses and have implemented that in our driving test and found some interesting results. I will discuss them at the end of this presentation, but before that, go through the procedures and background of the original algorithm that we have used. So it's about driving, and driving is a task requiring quite some attention. And if you look at the driving task, you can roughly say there's about 3 levels of that need attention in this particular task. There's a strategic level, and in that level has a very long time constant. It's about planning your trip, going from A to B, and you can take your time actually to do that. If you take longer, it has no real safety hazard. The next level is actually the maneuvering level. That is making all different sorts of decisions in traffic, overtaking, turning into a lane, passing cyclists, and so forth. That needs environmental input, and the output is controlled action patterns. Generally, decisions are made in the seconds level of timing. If you're a bit slow or a bit inattentive, that does not usually lead to dangerous situations. Think, for instance, of waiting for a traffic light and not attending it, and it goes to green, and there you stand for 3 or 4 seconds, and you'll be prompted by the car behind you to actually do something about that. The most basic level, however, is the control level of the car itself, keeping the car on the road. And that control level is actually what we are looking into in our over-the-road driving test in Maastricht. It has some environmental input, and the input is typically the position within the lane of the car, followed by some brain action to evaluate the position, and followed by automatic action patterns, which in this case is a steering correction. That, of course, causes a different position within the lane, leading again to brain action and steering correction. So this loop of control is important in actually keeping the car on the road. And if we look at that a little bit more closer, we could ask ourselves, okay, how often do corrections have to be made to do this? These are 2 graphs, a little bit different, in which we see the position of the car within the lane over a period of time. And on the left panel here, we see that this is in centimeters, that there's quite a few over time corrections to the left and to the right, resulting in a low amplitude signal with quite a high frequency. If we look at the right panel, we see a lower frequency of the signal, but also a higher amplitude. So there are less corrections being made in this particular part of the drive, resulting in a higher amplitude. We could also look at it in this way. On average, we see there's a certain weaving motion within the lane, and if it's low, due to frequent corrections, we will have a low standard deviation of the signal and a standard deviation of lateral position, typically being something like 18 centimeters in our test. However, if corrections are infrequent, the car will deviate on average more to the left than the right, sometimes even causing lane excursions. So SDLP actually is a good indicator of how well a person is and how often he is making corrections to keep the car within the lane. SDLP, however, is an overall measure of vehicle control. It is very sensitive, and it is our main outcome variable in our test. And how the difference between these 2 signals comes about is perhaps best demonstrated by a small piece of video that we've taken from one of our test subjects driving over the highway. As you can see, he's not very attentive, and this was a test done 4 hours post-dosing with alprazolam immediate release, 1 milligram, which is known to be a very sedative drug, and we're expecting him to perform quite badly. However, he was instructed, as always, to indicate if he was too sleepy to continue. And under these circumstances, even with what he's doing now, he still considered himself to be able to drive the car very well. Obviously, this is being monitored very closely during the drive, as always, and the driving instructor can intervene should it be necessary. Speed is still nicely 95 kilometers per hour, although the person is almost falling asleep. So this is something that causes an overall increase in weaving and standard deviation of lateral position, our primary outcome variable. So what happens if correction temporarily slows down or stops altogether, like when the subject falls asleep? The car will deviate significantly from the desired lane position and exit the lane and ultimately crash if nothing happens. And that is something which is, of course, very dangerous. This temporary reduction of control is thought to be caused by a lapse of attention. And a lapse can be like very long, or at least 4 or 5 seconds. Then the question arises, okay, what is a significant deviation caused by a lapse? The deviation occurs only occasionally. It's not like a continuous large deviation of weaving. It exceeds a certain magnitude and it lasts for a certain time. And the definition of a lapse for the purpose of this current project is that a lapse is defined as moving laterally from the chosen position in the lane by at least 100 centimeters for a minimum of 8 seconds. This definition is based on previous work and publications of the Utrecht Driving Research Group and published in Psychopharmacology in 2014 and also in some publications after that. But lapses have also been defined differently by other groups. So moving laterally from the chosen position in the lane by at least 100 centimeters for a minimum of 8 seconds, what does that mean for our driving test? If we look at a trace from a performance trace, we see in the top tracing here the position of the car within the lane. Now, to implement this particular definition, we have to find a reference of the preferred position of the lane, and then the subject should deviate by at least 100 centimeters for at least 8 seconds. And this should occur somewhere within the signal. So that's something that we can write an algorithm for and actually detect. Theoretically, this would look something like this. If we look at these data, again, the position of the car within the lane, then obviously this would probably qualify as a lapse. And in order to detect that in a reproducible way, we can define first a preferred position on the road, and that can be the mean position over the entire test, or maybe the preceding so many seconds before the detection of the lapse. So a moving average as opposed to a general average. The next step will be to define a lapse window, and a window which would be a box of 100 centimeters high relative to that particular signal and 8 centimeters wide. And that, we could move step by step over the driving test, and once the signal during this period is exceeding this particular box, it means that it exceeds more than 100 centimeters, we would define of having a lapse. And then it would move on to detect the next lapse. Now we've done that with historical data and also with data of the current project, and the results were very disappointing. We had about 30 test drives from previous studies, and these yielded no lapses at all, even under quite harsh conditions. And the analysis of 12 test drives of the present study also yielded no lapses. Obviously, this was both surprising and disappointing, and we've looked at possible causes why this was. So one of the causes is that we only have a limited amount of space that the car can actually move without exiting the lane. If we look at the dimensions of our car and lane, the whole lane is 3.5 meters or 350 centimeters wide. If the car is perfectly in the middle, given the dimensions of the car, we only have 86 centimeters on either side to deviate before exiting the lane. So moving 100 centimeters would cause both tires to be over the other lane shoulder. That's a very rare event, and provided is even allowed at all by the driving instructor. Exiting a lane for more than 8 seconds is something that is definitely not normal, and also not normal seen in our test drives. So that is something that was not Very good. We looked at our algorithm and we compared it to the one used by Joris Verster from Utrecht University and asked how he detected these lapses. And he said, okay, he did a visual inspection of the data to find the lapses, and that made it quite hard to compare our data to his, of course. He also used different forms of lapses, not only the singular deviation in one direction, as specified in this project, but also two other types of lapses. And that might offer a clue to the lack of finding of lapses in our data. And in the personal communication with Joris Verster, he explains the alternate forms of a lapse. And this is the type 1 lapse, the original one, also the one we are using for the current project, which have a preferred lane position and a deviation, singular deviation, for at least 8 seconds before returning to the preferred lane position. And this would be a type 1 lapse, and that is exactly the one that we are trying to detect in this project. But there's also an alternative lapse, the type 2 lapse. Here we also have a preferred lane position, and there is a lateral movement of 100 centimeters, but not in one direction relative to the preferred line position, but more an absolute movement. So the car moves at least 100 centimeters within a certain period of time. And this does not necessarily have to lead to a lane excursion. And the third one that he states is a sort of a multiphasic movement, which is actually building on the type 2. A few conclusions from the first go at this project was that type 1 lapses are very unlikely to occur. They lead to prolonged lane excursion, and our safety officer will not allow them to occur. He just stops the test before that or when that actually happens. And type 2 lapses might be a better alternative. So we're looking into those. And we've proposed a definition of a type 2 lapse as being an absolute lateral movement of the car of more than X centimeters occurring within Y seconds. And as a starting point, we loaded our algorithm with 100 centimeters of movement occurring within 8 seconds and tested some example data for results. So here again is a tracing of an actual test. This was a test taken from a project where we had zopiclone 7.5 milligrams tested in the morning after a evening dosing. This is the first part of the driving test actually, so 40 seconds to about 3 minutes. That's a portion of this test. What we see here is quite large deviations in the beginning of the test. Obviously the subject might not be very comfortable with the car yet, but he makes quite big deviations. If we test them for excursion for the type 2 lapse, and the type 2 lapse is now defined as 1 meter, absolutely not relative to a baseline for 8 seconds. So what we're actually looking for is a deviation, is a signal to enter here somewhere and to exit there before this time is over. So this looks like a deviation. We tested it, it's not. We could test this one, it does also not qualify. A little bit later on, 28 minutes into the drive to 30 minutes in the drive, the driving has settled down a bit. There are still large deviations, but the frequency has gone down quite a bit. Again, here there's no deviation, no lapse. This is also not a lapse, and this is also not a lapse. Going even further into the drive, we see that at about 48 minutes, there's a deviation here that is larger than 100 centimeters, which is the height of the box, and it occurs within 8 seconds. So this would qualify as a type 2 lapse as we define it. Obviously, if you make this smaller or shorter or longer, the definition of the lapse would be different. So with this algorithm, we've looked at a lot of data. Oh yes, of course, here something would have happened that caused this lapse. I think that the subject should have steered the other way, which he or she did not, causing this to happen. We've looked at historical data of a study with 28 subjects doing a crossover design with 4 different drugs and 2 different doses of an experimental drug, zopiclone 7.5 milligram and placebo, both on day 1 and day 8. And these obviously are the interesting data that we have to look at now. And we found a significant difference between the number of lapses in the zopiclone condition and in the placebo. There was both a drug effect and a time effect day 8 versus day 1. So this is something that it would be quite interesting, as this particular study also had effects on SDLP between these conditions, which one would expect with a positive control of 7.5 milligrams of zopiclone. Overall correlation with SDLP in this test was 0.6, which is also quite high, but of course to be expected. Output of the LAPS algorithm is a little bit different from what we specified for the current project. We can only detect the number of lapses, obviously, and the beginning of a lapse. So this particular file contained 3 lapses, one starting at 27 minutes, one at 48 minutes, and one at 50 minutes. And it marks the onset of the window in which the lapse was detected. The magnitude of the lapse is a little bit more difficult to define, and I don't think that it is very important at the moment. I think you want a minimum deviation and not an absolute one. But we could engineer that if necessary. So conclusions so far is that type 2 lapses can be detected systematically in our on-the-road driving test. And these lapses are defined as more frequent under zopiclone 7.5 milligram versus placebo conditions. So that is promising for the current study as well. What has to be answered next? Obviously, what are the optimal parameters of a type 2 lapse? Do we need to have a shorter time frame or longer? Should the amount of movement be larger or smaller as a threshold? That has to be determined yet. And of course, when is lapse meaningful? We can detect them, but when do they say anything meaningful about the subject being impaired at that particular moment? Okay, that's about it for this update. And if there is anything that you would like to ask, I'd be glad to discuss this with you through email or otherwise. Thank you for your attention.